Welcome everyone to a series. My name is Steve Norris. I'm a professor of history here at Miami, and I put together a series called History Matters using Zoom here. And the premise is to focus on why history matters, but also the various interdisciplinary approaches to the past, the other matters of the title here. And it's tied to my course, History 206, Introduction to Historical Inquiry, which is required of all history majors and preferably newly declared history majors or within a semester or two of declaring the major. The idea behind this series is the fifth and last version of the History Matters series, is to have open discussions and a conversational style. I'll pose a few questions for a half hour or so, no later, and then we'll throw open the floor for questions from the audience for 15 to 30 minutes, with preference given to the students in the class to ask questions, but anyone is welcome to ask questions. And when we reach that point, you can raise your hand in the chat. Or send me a note, or raise your hand using the blue pen, sorry, or send me a note through the chat. Today's discussion is on 1620, Plymouth and all that. And I'm really pleased, this is a very exciting conversation for me. I'm pleased to welcome Carla Gardina Pestana, my old colleague, back again via Zoom. Carla's professor of history and the Joyce Appleby Endowed Chair of America and the World, and also the chair of the history department at UCLA. Carla has published widely in the 17th and 18th century Atlantic worlds, especially the English Atlantic, published about the Caribbean and US religious history. And her book, The World of Plymouth Plantation, which you see over my shoulder, just appeared with Harvard University Press on the anniversary of 1620. And before that, her most recent book was The English Conquest of Jamaica, Oliver Cromwell's Bid for Empire, which was published in 2017 by Harvard University Press. And I'm also joined by TaraShea Nesbit, who is Assistant Professor of English, Fiction, and Creative Nonfiction at Miami. And she's the author of two novels, The Wives of Los Alamos, which came out in 2014 with Bloomsbury Press, and earlier this year, Beheld, a novel about the Plymouth colony, published also by Bloomsbury. So thank you both for agreeing to join me. And let me start by saying how enlightening it was to read Carla's book and then reread TaraShea's novel back to back in 2 weeks, which my students did too, because there's so many interesting overlaps that I hope will come out in our conversation. Carla's history, for those who haven't had the chance to read it yet, aims to explore the connections of the Plymouth plantation with the wider world, while TaraShea's novel takes the first murder there in 1630, a murder where John Billington, one of the first people on the original Mayflower, killed John Newcomen as a chance to peer inside the workings of the Plymouth colony. And one of the first things Carla says in her history is, and one of the first things she asks is, how well do we really know Plymouth? It's the central question both she and TaraShea pose. Most of us, at least certainly I do, see Plymouth more as an abstraction, as a myth even, more than a real existing place. In fact, TaraShea writes in her note for readers that she wanted to challenge certain myths, while Carla, you wrote that you're not wanting to debunk myths as much as offer something new in the way we understand Plymouth. So let me start with that basic premise. Well, for both of you, what were the most problematic aspects associated with Plymouth that you wanted to correct, and why? Maybe Carla could go first and then TaraShea.
Thanks, Steve. It's fun to be here. Thanks for having me. I wish I could be in Oxford in person, but of course, these are extraordinary times. So when I was thinking, I started thinking about Plymouth because I went there for a meeting that was supposed to help the people who do Plymouth Plantation, the Living History Museum, revise their presentation. And it struck me how that place is presented and how Plymouth in general is presented as very isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, the kind of heroic narrative about, arriving on this cold shore and being all alone and meeting one Indian and, all of this kind of these images that we have suggested as a kind of cut off place. And the emphasis on it as first, and these people being by themselves and how intrepid they must have been, seemed to me to reinforce that. And so at that meeting, I kept trying to get them to think about its connections to other places, because I was doing Atlantic history then and I was interested in that. And no one was buying it. I couldn't get anyone to pay any attention to what I had to say. I did notice that they did a little display, dockside display, a few years later when they took away the Mayflower 2 to be renovated, and they wanted something there for people to read. That was like, oh, these people were connected to other people. Except the way they narrated it was when they got to Cape Cod, the connections were over. So it was like I had succeeded absolutely not at all in making my point. So that gave me the idea of writing this book, to think about it as one of a number of new places where the English people were trying to go, as having to deal with a lot of the same kinds of things that other English people in other places were having to deal with, as being sustained by and shaped by the ways it was connected to other places. So, I read a lot of histories that either said, oh, there was a rock, there was a meeting of with an Indian, there was a harvest meal, there was, going through all the different myths, or other histories that said there wasn't really a rock, the meeting with the Indian was much different, it wasn't really exactly a harvest, it wasn't really a day of Thanksgiving. I'd read all that kind of back and forth on the myths, and I just thought, yeah, why would I do that again? So instead, I just decided to set all those aside and just think about the connections, which were what was interesting to me.
Yeah, I admit before I read Beheld, which is a segue to TaraShea's answer here, that I hadn't really thought much of the colony beyond just 1620 and 1621, that first winter that we all think we know about, where isolation is the key, and didn't really even consider much what had happened after. So, which is, of course, the subject of TaraShea. So I'm curious what you have to say about what myths you were aiming mostly to correct. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks, Steve, for the invitation. It's so great to be in conversation with you, Carla. I think that part of this gets at what's wonderful about crossovers in our research, but differences as a fiction writer or historian. So from Carla, part of what I hear is like the conversation that you enter is one among historians or among representations, that you'd heard before. And for me, the one that I was entering was like, what has appeared in a novel before? And what does a kind of popular imagination have a sense of? And that performance of the Pilgrims and Indians was part of my childhood. Just as a curiosity, did any of you perform a kind of Pilgrim and Indians play as a child? Yeah, so, and I'm fascinated by how those first stories that were told are so solidified for us that it becomes complicated to see them differently, to kind of untangle them. And I had just finished writing The Wives of Los Alamos, and I knew I was interested in turning points in American history where there's shifts in power. And that first myth became the first thing I started to think about, of course, after finishing that book is what's another turning point in American history? And it is when the Mayflower passengers arrive in the northeastern woodlands. Thinking about my own kind of performing of that story, which I knew was problematic, but I didn't know how problematic it was until I was in an early American literature class reading William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation and noticing that he mentions all the details of his first wife, or all the details of the cause of death that first winter. A seaman who falls overboard on the Mayflower, probably got what was coming to him because he was really mean to the Puritans, but he leaves out the cause of death of his first wife. So initially I didn't start with like, I want to debunk the myth as much as, why did he not mention the death of his first wife, who we only know roughly 80 years later, there's a written account that says that she slips off of the ship, but it's not a firsthand account, and it's problematic in many ways. So from that question, I think I was pursuing two questions. One was like, why does he not mention her death? And then if he's leaving this out, what else is he leaving out? And that led me to uncover all kinds of other things that I thought I knew about the Mayflower passengers, like they already had religious freedom in Holland, as Carla has described as well. They were really, I think, looking for a kind of sense of their own isolationist utopia. We will continue, they will all be like us, except economically that didn't work out. Their sense of xenophobia, they were worried their kids were becoming too Dutch and they were intermarrying. So really almost everything I thought I knew that I had been told about that journey needed a little bit of complication, but in part it was because it was a story that was solidified for me at about 8 or 9. And so I think it takes a lot more to then look at it again and again and again. Also because we have wonderful books like Firsting and Lasting and Memory Lands that are taking a look at that like 1800s time period in which there's this real push to say, let's remember these pilgrims, these Puritans in this wonderful way. And in doing so, you're kind of writing out the existence of Native Americans with all of these interesting intentions behind that. So I could talk a lot about what I learned. It was numerous things because I knew very little.
When I first read the novel, when it first came out, I kept having to Google, did this person really exist? Is John Billington really a person? And Eleanor Billington, yes, as a matter of fact. I knew nothing about Dorothy Bradford. I won't ruin the story. That's William Bradford's first wife that TaraShea sort of organizes the narrative around. And you have an answer or sort of an answer about what you think happened to her, but I won't get to that. I'm struck by the fact you both answered about the way your own disciplines kind of led you to revisit stories of Plymouth. And so maybe the next question for both of you is again, something that struck me reading the two books back to back, the choices you made in organizing them and the structure you provide to the book. So in Carla's case, each chapter has a triptych where there's a person, a concept, and a thing associated with Plymouth. And the first group of people you talk about are wives. And then of course, TaraShea, you use the voices primarily of Alice Bradford, the second wife and friend of Dorothy, and then Eleanor Barrington, the wife of the soon-to-be murderer. So you sort of know this is looming. So you jump back and forth between voices. So I'm curious to hear you speak about how you came about how you reached the decision to adopt these structures and why you think it works in the way you want to revisit these stories of Plymouth. Maybe Carla again first, and then.
Okay. Well, this is a weird book for me because usually I just go to the archives and stay there about 10 years and then write up what I found. And this was not that book. This book, I knew what I thought was true before I started doing the research, which is like breaking a cardinal rule for historians. But at the same time, I knew it couldn't be an unconnected place. Like that was so illogical that I just thought this is a connected place. So what I did is I started going through all the standard sources that are available for the first 20 or so years and just looking at connections, just rereading them for connections. One of them is William Bradford, which TaraShea mentioned, which is a really interesting two-part account that first, he writes a description in about 1630 of everything that led to them arriving in 1620. And then some years later, he picks up with a year-by-year account of them being in the colony. So it's partly a journal, kind of similar to John Winthrop's journal in the later part, but in the opening part, it's a kind of origins narrative. But then there's two published accounts that describe the first years. There's court records. There's a variety of other things. And so I just went through those and made notes about connections, every kind of connection. And then I had to think, how would I tame this into something? I didn't know if it was an article or if it was a book or what kind of book it was. And so then I thought about it from the other direction, which is Atlantic history. And I teach Atlantic history, and I've thought a lot about Atlantic history. So I thought, well, Atlantic history is organized around connections. And one way to think about that is things that connect people. So there's a huge commodity history, for instance, and about people circulating. And a less developed aspect of this, but one that I also think is important, is ideas. And so I thought, what if I organized it around people, things, and ideas? And then I just started sorting it that way. So that's how I kind of came up with the triptychs, the kind of 3 different short chapters going people, idea, thing, people, idea, thing. And then, then I had to figure out now what? So it was very much a process. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about how my books should be organized just in general. But for this one, I feel like that was a huge part of the process for me, was the figuring out exactly what the shape of it would look like. It's also a different book because it's not really meant for other historians. it's meant more for a popular audience, for, other readers, or as much for other readers as for my fellow scholars. So that was part of the process of thinking about how to organize it as well.
Well, it worked really well. I mean, maybe it worked as well for historians who don't normally study Plymouth or early American history and studies things like the Soviet Union.
Well,
And
thank
when
you.
when I reread Beheld, I was actually marking in the margins, here's where the animals come in, here's where the furs are in here, here's where the guns are. I mean, the objects that Carla talks about that I hadn't really picked up on the first time I read it. And maybe for you, TaraShea, the question about structure might also be asked that you frame it so much around Alice and Eleanor, these two women. And in your note for the readers, you say that you even heard their voices speak to you at one point, and that's what led you to kind of structure the novel this way. So tell us more about how that happens, how you heard them speak to you, and why you decided to focus the novel on the relationships with these two women who are neighbors, but not at all alike, really.
Yeah, it sounds very woo-woo. They were speaking to me, and usually I'm like, come on. But it did sort of happen like that, but it took a while, I'll say. I started researching this novel like 6 or 7 years ago, and I wrote an entire, in terms of answering structure, I will say that it took a long time to get to the structure that you now see. And I had written it, the first novel, the first version is entirely in Dorothy Bradford's voice, so the first wife. And after I felt like I knew her, then I realized I needed to be able, and I was simultaneously just coming to understand all of the intertextual things that are happening, historical things that are happening at the same time, and that I wanted to bring more in. So I was looking for a way to highlight both what was happening with Dorothy and what I was seeing happening in the court records and what laws were occurring, like as a way of understanding what, who and what are considered criminal and what happens to those people and how it relates to class and privilege and access and all this other stuff. So I was in London actually teaching at the Lit London program. And it was a wonderful kind of break from writing. I was working so diligently, but I felt like there was something that wasn't coming through. I was maybe 3 years into writing it. And at this point, I had discovered Alice, but I wasn't really sure about that second voice. But the Billington trial shows up in the court records, and I suddenly I was sitting on the back porch, and I just heard her. I just sort of saw her, and it was like, it's Eleanor Billington. That's exactly. I've been kind of writing around her, but the Billington family shows up in Bradford's records. So I'd always sort of thought, like, he hates them so much, like. What, I can understand what about them. They weren't of the same faith. And they were, like their kids were like getting in the gunpowder and setting the ship on fire. I mean, there were reasons not to like them, but I thought, can I find anything redeeming about them? And what would be the motivation for being, to push back against a kind of authority of Bradford? And so Eleanor emerged that way. And I realized that because Bradford tells his story in third person plural, they call themselves the pilgrims, they, which is a very godlike point of view. And at some point I thought, oh, I could do that. They call themselves the women or something. But I had actually written my first novel in first person plural. We all argued with the military not to extend the firing range, referring to Los Alamos, that I didn't want to do that. And I wanted to get as intimate as I could. And when I write in first person, that's when I can do that, even though sometimes I'll switch it back to third. So I started alternating, and I knew that because they were of different faith, one, as I've imagined Eleanor, she's a newly freed indentured servant, or she's recently out of indentured servitude. So she would have a very different experience of Plymouth, and the court records show that. And Alice would have a different experience. And so I was hoping to complicate the stories of what was happening in Plymouth by showing multiple people in conversation. And then the men they're kind of pushed back. They recede, and they're in the third person. And I wanted to have I wanted them to recede a little bit because I wanted it to be the story of the women.
That's fascinating. I hadn't picked up on entirely all of that when I was reading it. But you did mention, I mean, the focus is obviously in many ways on the servant class. As you said, Eleanor is a formerly indentured servant, as was her husband. And that's what drives his anger toward his new neighbor, the newcomer, and the murder, therefore. So, Carla writes in her history that servants were both essential and potentially dangerous to Plymouth. And your novel, if nothing else, proves that statement. In fact, one character even notes the grandest threat was within your own community. So, and one of the triptych people that Carla focuses on is called servants. So I want to hear you speak a little bit more about why you decided to focus on servants and what the focus on servants allows us to understand better about this Plymouth that has been fixed in our minds as this, isolated, almost unchanging place. Maybe this time, TaraShea, you can pick up on what you were just saying a little more.
Sure. I was reading, what is it? White Trash. I was reading White Trash and the History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter the same time I was writing, and came to see, that's how I came to the understanding that there were indentured servants. You can see them listed as like just a name or a servant, but it hadn't occurred to me. And from there, I started researching more. And I focused there because, well, many reasons, but we can see from the foundings that there were class differences, there were economic differences, and there was different kinds of access. So for instance, one of the early laws was that you could not trade with an Indian unless you had the governor's approval. So you might think about that, like, well, what would that matter? Well, it could matter in many ways, because you can't make more money by trading unless you have the approval of somebody who might not agree with you. In fact, multiple ministers were kicked out of Plymouth, one for preaching in the Anglican way, not preaching to people who had a different faith. So, and part of what I was thinking about in the book initially was thinking of the contemporary space of how we think about immigrants and how we think about starting from a sense of equality, and it wasn't equal in that way. But also, I think I probably would have, my family lineage would be more on the side of the servant than the ruling class. And so I have a sort of underdog heart. But what else was happening there that we could think about?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the Norrises would have been thrown over the side of the Mayflower on the way over, had they even been allowed on it in the first place. But Carla, tell us a little more about, the statement that's so interesting about how the servants were both essential and potentially dangerous to Plymouth. I like that sentence so much, and it runs through TaraShea's novel.
Well, there are very few servants on board the Mayflower, and the Billingtons are not among them, in fact. I have to say, being the historian with the red pen who's circling things in her mind, you couldn't marry if you were in service. So servant, and that's the big point of my chapter. Servants are usually young people who are brought in to work for a certain number of years. In England, service is a year-by-year undertaking. There's servant fairs. If masters need new servants, they can go to these fairs and hire servants. And people are desperate for work, so there's never a shortage. You might get let go if you're not acceptable, etc. But in Plymouth, there is a shortage. In every colony in the Americas, there is a shortage. So what happens is a different way of getting people into service gets developed, which is to create a kind of indentured servitude in which a person agrees to an indenture, not in order to get skills training, which is how indentures work, apprenticeships works in England, but in fact, they agree to get their transport to the colony in exchange for a certain number of years of work. And all the early colonies use this, trying to get laborers to come over. So you arrive in service and you have a set number of years, 4 or 7 years. Mayflower descendants that I talked to are really sure that didn't happen in Plymouth. So, because they have this kind of democratic, everybody's equal sort of, everybody was on the Mayflower and that's what really matters, kind of an image. But it's clear from the court records that a lot of people are brought in, not a lot, not as many as they want because they're hard to get. And Plymouth doesn't have a lot of money, but people are brought in to do this service. And for the amount of time that they're in service, they're basically supposed to be celibate. because, as I said, they can't marry. They can't have their own household if they can't afford to have a household, because they're living in someone else's house and working off the time that they owe. So that creates this class of basically college-age people, teenagers and young adults, who are supposed to not be having sexual relations. So huge numbers of the court records are about servants getting pregnant, servants getting caught having sex, all these kind of things. And so the point I make in part in there is that this group of people they're desperate to bring in are not easy to control, and are not necessarily going to live by the laws and the rules that exist. And so, for those reasons, there's also a sense in Bradford that there's a certain type of people that you want in Plymouth, and the Billingtons, he's pretty clear, are not that type. And service, if it's just hire somebody who wants to come to America and put them on a ship and, use their labor after they get there, is not a very good way to vet who's coming. And so in that respect, he thinks, people who don't believe in their values, whatever those might be, are more likely to come through that avenue. So yeah, so that's the reason why, or one of the main reasons why, servants are seen as dangerous, but also you can't live without them. So,
and you've both mentioned Bradford, and clearly Bradford's book, the World of Plymouth Plantation, the book, or his own account of it, is an important source you both mine. And I was trying to think who comes off worse in the novel, Bradford or Miles Standish, who would have been the only two people I could have named up to now. And maybe Miles Standish a little bit more, but I don't know. William Bradford doesn't come off very well. And Carla, in your history, I mean, clearly Bradford occupies an important place, but neither he nor Miles Standish are central characters in the way you describe the world of plantation, which I think is both interesting. So I'm curious, maybe my last question will be what you think of him now that you've had to spend so much time with him, that is William Bradford. And in a sense, I guess this is about how you read between the lines of a primary source. How did you do so as a historian, Carla, to tease out different meanings? And also TaraShea, I'm really intrigued about how you have Bradford's account of Billington as a person and his actions called into question, because you narrate the story from the reverse perspective, Billington himself and then his wife, Eleanor. And then you even have in your novel a section where Eleanor talks about how Bradford gets to kill the truth forever by writing the version of history he wants, which I find really intriguing. So tell us a little more about how you used Bradford as a source and how you reacted to him and what you think of him now, I guess, after having to spend so much time with him. Maybe Carla can start this time.
Well, I don't spend time with them in the same way that TaraShea does, of course. I mean, I do sometimes hear these people's voices and feel like I get to know them in the various research that I've done over the last many decades. But I read Bradford as fairly defensive. And I read him as less worried about some of the kinds of things that are on display when you look at it from the women's point of view, as the novel does, and more about what is Plymouth's role in the region. So he starts writing just as Massachusetts Bay Colony is being founded, and over the next 10 years, Plymouth is going to get completely overwhelmed by 20,000 immigrants coming into Massachusetts and then fanning out through New England. And at this time, Plymouth is a few hundred people who've just started to hive off into separate little towns outside of actually the town of Plymouth. So he knows they're going to get overwhelmed. And so I read him as really trying to to narrate a story about the origins that give Plymouth an important place. And then when he picks up the day-to-day, what's gone on, then he's the governor. He switches hats and he becomes the governor. And then he's describing, the reason why you can't trade with Indians is because the original settlement incurred an enormous debt. And so the people who set up the plantation, the leaders on the Mayflower, basically owe huge amounts of money which keeps going up because they keep receiving more shoes and cows and the various objects that I talk about. So the colony itself has a huge debt, and the only really viable plan to pay it off is to send beaver skins, basically. So they want all the trade in the region to go through Plymouth's official coffers, onto ships, back to the London investors. And it takes them till 1646. So it takes them 26 years to pay off this debt. And until that time, they're trying to limit trade in the region to just this official trade. They actually set up trading outposts outside of Plymouth itself, because Plymouth is in the wrong place if you want to have the beaver trade. They don't have a major river going through there, which is how you would travel to the interior if you were a native hunter. And so they have these trading outposts. They set up their own people to run them. Then the stuff is supposed to come back to Plymouth and go toward this collectively owed debt. And Billington owes it as well as Bradford. Everybody who comes initially owes that debt. They eventually create a small kind of syndicate of leaders that assume the debt and get a lot of power to hand out land and a lot of other things as a result. But that's after Billington has died, basically, has been executed for murder. So,
and that sort of profit motive and the knowledge of the debt is what drives Bradford's behavior in the way you describe it, TaraShea, and in some ways too, it makes him slightly sinister, right? That he's or seen as a hypocrite by especially the Billington. So tell us a little more about your Bradford.
Yeah, I will say by the end, as it always happens, I become more sympathetic to who I think are undersung villains, but we don't think of them as villains. I think that part of what is driving them is a want for economic gain. He was in Holland as an immigrant, couldn't rise economically, tries to start a business that like reduces interaction with the middleman of the country to stamp his like cloth. It's a whole other backstory. But when he gets a little bit more money, they're thinking about where to go, and all of these sound like in the weeds details, but they were all little moments of having me think about why didn't they go to Ghana? Why didn't they go to New Netherlands where they were offered? They wanted to be separate. And then but I think in part it was that sense of, can we make a utopian community? Can we make a community that is living in God's way? And that sounds wonderful. And it's just real complicated. It's really complicated when you try it out. And particularly when you're in debt. What do you do to make sure that you can pay that debt off? I was also surprised that there were multiple trading posts, which I did not know about at the time. But one of the things that I kept returning to is when their pastor, John Robinson, doesn't go with them. And he writes when Bradford is somewhat saying in celebration that they had killed a handful of Indians under Miles Standish's lead. And Pastor Robinson says, "Concerning ye killing of these poor Indians, of which we heard at first by reports, oh, how happy a thing had it been if you had converted some before you had killed any. Besides, where blood is once begun to be shed, it is seldom staunched of long after." And he says it is more glorious in men's eyes than pleasing in God's. And then he goes on to warn him about Miles Standish's temper and how he's not perhaps, he's maybe wanting in tenderness is the exact quote. So I'm imagining Bradford looking back on his life and part of that recollection and having both regret and some reverie, but speaking to wanting to have this book and this place live in perpetuity, which it has. So in some ways he was quite successful in that. And so I have mixed feelings. I think he was probably in great grief when his wife died, which is partly why he didn't speak of it. And, all of these other things. I think he's a complicated person like we all are. And the book says the rest, I guess.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and it's fascinating to me that you both use this source. I mean, maybe that's the point of bringing us together here, that you both read and then you read between the lines and you ask questions of it, and then you imagine the way things might really have happened based on the motivations of people mentioned. So that Miles Standish, who as you read, is Bradford is warned about, is known by the other by the former servants as Shrimpy, or the man that no one would want to marry, for instance, is to tease more to the novel. But it's
let me jump in here about Bradford for a second and just say that one fascinating thing about this source is that it was lost for about 70 years, and it wasn't published until the middle of the 19th century. So we think of it as the, uber source, but a lot of the myths of Plymouth were created without it, largely.
And we even have part of that worked into the novel, where it's his wife that stores it, and then we are left to guess how it eventually gets discovered. So maybe I think now is a good time. I've just gone over the half hour to throw open the floor for anyone else who has questions. You can either raise your hand using the function, the raise hand function, the blue hand, and I can call on you, or you can type something into the chat room here. I'll talk for the 7 seconds that we're supposed to pause and let these things happen. But people who want to ask either TaraShea Nesbit or Carla Pestana a question. I have more. Joyce, go ahead.
Hi, and this is like a question for both of you, because like I like both of your input on this. Do you think that like American school systems have made an effort to try and get away from the idea of like, oh, the Native Americans and the Pilgrims were friends and they had dinner together and it was a really nice time? Do you think that they've like made like enough of an effort, maybe not enough, but just like a significant effort to try and get away from that narrative?
No. I mean, I think a huge amount of the scholarship that's aimed at public consumption, like at Plymouth Plantation, the Living History Museum, has really tried to get more accurate about the Native side of this story. And most of the commemorative stuff that was planned for the 400th anniversary was going to be about the Native story. Not only here, but in Leiden, where I was supposed to go to a conference in the Netherlands, and also 2 conferences in England that were planned that had to be canceled. So there's a lot of effort in people that are kind of public facing through museums and other interpretive works toward the public to get people to think about these other issues. But I think for students, young students, it's still presented very simplistically. And in fact, in most parts of the country, you'd be eviscerated as a curriculum administrator if you said anything much else. My sister teaches the 4th grade in California, which is more, where they're more able to talk about these aspects of the past. But I lived in Ohio for a long time, and I have friends all over the country. And I can tell you that, in states where enslaved Africans are talked about as immigrants in school textbooks, there's not a high priority to saying that, there was anything but goodness coming out of, people coming to Plymouth and what impact they had on Native peoples.
I don't have my child is 5, so we will just start this. And I can't speak for the whole country, but I would agree with Carla. Generally, particularly, I know that the community with which I live in, as recently as a few years ago, I was inquiring, like, what was it like? Do they do Pilgrim and Indian thing? And I'm hearing, yeah, they do. But then I also wonder, where should we direct our energy towards shifting that change? And I think that it can come from multiple places. So is there a handed curriculum? Are the teachers making their curriculum? How are the parents and the community talking about it? And so I'm thinking about how we can triage and complicate by having multiple sources that are adding something else. When I started this book, one of the first thing I looked into was like, has anybody ever written about this? And no one had. And so part of it, I think, also is finding ways to make those increasing access to alternative stories, like Donlan voices, different kinds of Wampanoag leaders speaking about their experience. I'm hopeful, thinking of all of you as our future educators, potentially, that you're having these stories complicated and that you will be teaching the complicated version.
Dylan had a question in the chat about whether or not TaraShea and I had been to the actual location of what we are studying. I am married to the biggest climate fanatic in the history of Oxford, Ohio. I know some of my friends who are here know that Dawn ran a climate film series and was talking about the climate, tried to get the city to agree to be a climate, change city, etc. During the time we lived there, unsuccessfully, I might add, on that last point. So I have a really complicated relationship to travel, but in fact, I do go to the places that I write about. I always go to the places that I write about because I feel like you can't, it's really hard to know on the most basic level what the kinds of things I want to be able to imagine when I'm writing, unless you've physically been there. When you go to Plymouth itself, the other part of Dylan's question, when you go to Plymouth itself, the town is a town. It's a New England town. It's got this little temple that looks great, vaguely classical, sitting next, on the sand next to the side of the road that you look down on from the sidewalk, that has a piece of a random boulder in it. But and there's statues, and there's like a couple spots that are like commemorated as this or that, but the actual place where the town was originally sited is part of the town. So you can walk around and read historical markers and stuff, but you don't see. So Plymouth, the plantation that you go to where they've recreated, is at a site outside of the town. And they have a museum there, and then they have an actual settler village with a palisade around it, and then they also have more and more native interpretive stuff going on at the same time. But you can walk around where they were, but it's been transformed into a small seaside New England town where you eat clam chowder and do all those New England tourist things. So
yeah, I've traveled there multiple times, but I hadn't been before I was interested in writing the book. And I was on a fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society, which is one of the few large archives that also offers fellowships for creative artists who want to use the archives. And so I was in Worcester, Massachusetts, and then I would travel to the coast and do some research, take my kids, and it resulted in some very funny stories. But I also worked with a Wampanoag knowledge holder to inquire about their experience, their stories, which pointed out things to me like, so this person that I worked with read the whole book, like we were in conversation, and then I wrote the book, and then she read the book, and she was like, you're leaving out things, small things, like you say here that the Indian men are taller, but actually, what about the Indian women? What about the Wampanoag women? Or near the end, that would be a good place for you to mention that there were Indian slaves. And so these kinds of things. So your question about the kinds of research, part of that for me is walking the land, thinking about the physical environment, trying to remap the way that the trees, the plants, the land, the native land is or isn't there now. And then talking to people. And I did have conversations, some friendly and some not friendly, with, what are they called, Carla? The passed down Mayflower people.
the descendants?
The descendants, yeah, Mayflower descendants, which you've kind of mentioned that they can be a little testy about their stories, wanting to hold on to their stories. I encountered that as well. Yeah. And so I was having a lot of dialogue, both in the space, reading books, but then trying to learn other ways knowledge is passed down.
If I could interrupt, there are two passages in the novel that aren't voices of people. One's called Meanwhile and one's called Nature. So was being there and physically present, was that what led you to include that section called Nature?
Yes, I think that is really the beginning of what I'm working on now. I've started to really be interested in centering the non-human as a viable way of telling a story. And that just emerged. But yes, I was there and I spent a lot of time thinking about like, what is the name of this tree that I don't know? What is this plant? Those kinds of things. And I did a lot of research. I just sort of geeked out on like, what are the ways that the land is alive and living longer than all of the people that have lived there, and what stories can it tell us?
I like how you said it doesn't care, and to a certain degree, about the hanging of John Billington. Drew has a question, and then Curtis.
Yeah, I really enjoyed both your guys' works, but this question is specifically for TaraShea. And with that, I was just curious on why you chose characters like Alice and Eleanor, like really not traditionally well-known, like Plymouth Rock settlers, or just basically upon reading your book, I really thought they're kind of like normal people. Like they didn't have like any crazy like specific qualities or anything. So like, why did you choose some people that were so like normal, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, part of it is that the ones that are, I think I'm often looking for the people that we haven't heard a lot about, but maybe below that project is maybe something I really believe, which is that all of us and our tiny lives, building a community can and do make a difference in larger scale things, and that actions that are taken that seem to have like big effects happen on the very personal and ordinary way of a sense of how you're responding in your everyday life. So I think it's important to attend to and shine light on people that haven't been, talked about. But I think that it's also interesting to just spend time with people who aren't, they're not the man fighting the war, but they're making the community that makes the atomic bomb, and so they have a really big impact, even though they might seem ordinary, which is how we might feel about ourselves too.
Curtis, you have a question.
Hi there. So one thing that is touched on a lot is talking about America's hometown, like what people consider, or what we should as Americans consider in our origin story, if you want to call it that. Which one is like I'm struggling with my words here. Basically, there's the argument between Jamestown and Plymouth a lot. And I was wondering if there are any moral reasons that either one of you think we should or should not consider Plymouth our hometown, because I personally would like to look at Plymouth as America's hometown over Jamestown. But I didn't know if you two as authors had any comments on if there's any moral problem with, even though we recognize historically it isn't told the way it really was, is there a problem necessarily with considering Plymouth our hometown, America's hometown, I mean to say?
I'm actually teaching a course this quarter that is 1619 versus 1620. And later, tomorrow afternoon, my students are reading the 1619 letter that talks about the arrival of the first 20 odd Africans sold as slaves off a Dutch privateer in 1619. So we're actually talking about these as two origin points. One thing that's recently occurred to me that I don't know why it never did before, but when the people in Plymouth start making Plymouth into the origins of New England, it's before the United States. So there's no competition with Virginia at that time. I mean, they're not thinking, what's the origin of the United States? They're just very locally minded. Our little relatively impoverished, unimportant corner of the large colony of Massachusetts is actually the origin of this whole region, is what they're initially thinking. I tell my students that 1520 and Puerto Rico is the first place in the current United States to ever have enslaved Africans. That we never hear about that from anybody who talks about these, what are your origins, and is it in slavery, or is it in a different narrative that's associated with Plymouth. These two regions of Virginia and Plymouth battled it out in the 19th century, which was the origin. But at the time, Virginians weren't saying, our origins are slavery. Virginians were saying our origins are aristocratic, upper class, elite, gracious lifestyle. So they were all about basically the plantation. And the way they wanted to tell the story was in terms of Pocahontas was a princess. A lot of the men who migrated in the middle of the 17th century to Virginia were younger sons of the aristocrats who had sided with Charles I in the Civil Wars and had left to come to Virginia after he was defeated and beheaded. You know, so they have this story that goes with the kind of romanticized Gone with the Wind version of the South. And they were fighting for that in the 19th century, early 19th century, while New Englanders were fighting for Plymouth. And Plymouth, of course, stands for hard work, family values, suffering for a larger good, religious freedom, etc. So those were the kind of dueling narratives at that time. It's a really interesting question. We could talk about it for forever, but that's all I'll say.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you answered that so well. I'm not sure that I could add too much because I didn't do a ton of research on Virginia. But
so we have a question in the chat from Justin saying, how do you balance your voice and then the voice of characters, given especially the long stretch of time between writing and reading and when the voices were written? And then he goes on to say, assuming they had different ways of understanding themselves and others, what were some important ways their thinking aligned with and diverged from your own that you had to keep in mind while writing? Maybe that's a question directed at TaraShea first.
I think that gets at one of the hardest parts about thinking about writing historical fiction. We don't all, as historical fiction writers, come to it with the same amount of research interest. And like I have a friend who will write a novel set in 1930, and she will just make place markers, like enter the kind of car they would have. And this feels like, oh my goodness, like you wouldn't know the cultural context with which this love affair happens. But so part of the writing that's so difficult for me is that I understand in part what I don't understand, which are things like the worldview in terms of science, in terms of religion, trying to remap a sense of the role that like doctors would play or midwives would play, you know, all of these things. So I know that I'm having a conversation with the past. I know that I'm imagining, as Carla mentioned, as far as I understood the Billington family, they were not listed as they were coming in from England, but they weren't listed exactly in any category. And so as I state, I've imagined her as an indentured servant, but that sounds like a kind of detail that like, you know, like so much you don't know. So I don't think that there's like, the way that I balance it is to try to research as much as I can and be gentle with myself and to understand that I'm having a conversation with the past, but I'm very rarely asserting it was like this. And part of the way that I try to nod to that to the reader are doing things like multiple voices that have very different opinions about what happened. But scary things happen. Like I wrote this like grief section because in real life, Dorothy only had one child. All of her friends had many children. So it seems quite real that she probably had pregnancy losses or infertility. And then I'm writing that, and then I have my own personal story with grief happening simultaneously. And so when that comes together, it's really weird because it's like, I could go back to the thing I just wrote about how this person was in a lot of grief, and now I'm like kind of in a similar position. So there isn't any hard and fast rule to do it, I guess. And I just keep trying to work it out. And that's part of the excitement too.
Let me just say too, that I can read TaraShea's novel with a red pen in my hand and find every factual error. But at the same time, I'm in awe of what she does, which is put herself into this mindset of a 17th century woman, which I don't have to do. I can tell you this thing is not a true thing about this time and place, but I can't do the thing that she does. My father used to say to me, why are you a historian? Why don't you write historical novels? You might actually make some money. Like, because I'm doing the thing that in a way seems easier to me.
And I'm like, I can't remember all those dates. Like, I'm like, I can get the feel of it. But when I have to recollect everything, it gets to be a little too much.
Ooh, we've just reached the moment I hope for in this conversation where we're talking about what history does versus fiction and what we can do. And I'm in awe too. I mean, I because I find the the reaction's so believable because of the way you tie them to simple things that I think as historians we often don't think about when we're writing about people. Like the fact that probably Dorothy did have a miscarriage, or the way in which anger or jealousy or just or desire of any kind affects the way people act in history. That can be really hard for those of us who are historians to work into our writings, because the evidence is lacking, even though we know that these things do of course drive the way people acted now and in the past. So maybe as a last question on this front, for Carla first, what's one of your favorite, or maybe your favorite historical novel, and why? And then for TaraShea, what's your favorite work of history and why?
Wow. That's okay. So let me just say I don't read many historical novels because for this very reason. I I want to put away my red pen when I read novels. But I mean, there are some classics that I have taught and I have enjoyed, like things by Toni Morrison about slavery, or but normally I avoid novelistic versions of the things I study. Although I did, in fact, read and enjoy TaraShea's book, it's not my usual reading for fun. So I'm not sure I have a favorite.
I thought you were going to say Wolf Hall for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very impressed by that rethinking of that principal character of Cromwell. But I also recommended that to a lot of people who found it unreadable because of the point of view thing that she does, which I didn't mind, but which, yeah. So that to some extent tempers my admiration, although not my personal enjoyment for that book.
I am envious of those of you that are coming to history and a kind of like, okay, here are the classics, and then we read the other things, and then there's the other, because I am really reading from the back door. I like come in the back door and I'm like, okay, what are all the things? And then I'm trying to understand how it might be seen by others by reading peer reviewed journals, reviewing it, which is like the preface to say that I can give you a lot of books that I've enjoyed, but I couldn't pick one because it would be so specific to what I was reading at the time. But I will share, because I have this up. You can slideshow, play from current slide. Not that, but, oh, well, geez, okay. Here are a couple things that I really liked related to this book. So Seasons of Misery by Kathleen Donegan, and how she, and dissenting bodies, corporalities in early New England, because they're working with thinking of the body. Donlin Voices is not that. And then these books, Our Beloved Kin. I was in conversation with Lisa Brooks as I was working on the book because I just needed a little bit of help, and she was so wonderful. And Memory Lands and Firsting and Lasting. But I couldn't name you just one because it really just depends on the book that I'm working on at the time.
That's really interesting, though. I've always wondered, what sort of work you do to go into the historical novel to get at least some of it right in the plausible world that you're creating for us, and how that operates, so that historians like me can read it and say, wow, this is really interesting. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. This is really, really interesting. I've learned a lot. I'm going to stop the recording